Well, good afternoon, everyone. And this is the last session of the day. I'm very pleased to be with you. My name is Zoe Daniel. I'm the member for Goldstein, and I'm reprising my former life as a journalist in the sense that I'm going to have the great pleasure of moderating this session with Richard Denniss from the Australia Institute. And our modus operandi today is to bring together the themes of the day, the power of putting people at the centre of politics and doing things differently, new ways of thinking. And in doing that, we'll try to explore this new political landscape with the rise of the community independents, of which I am one, and very much hoping to expand that cohort. So without taking up your time, I will allow the person who has probably much more incisive things to say about this than me, Richard Denniss, to join the conversation. Hey, Richard.
Hey, Zoe.
Very good to see you. And we have a big agenda for the next 40 minutes or so, just to try to pull all of this together. Our topic today is doing politics differently, new power, new thinking, new language. Where should we start?
Well, language is, so important for so many reasons. Obviously, it's how we communicate with other people, but language also helps shape the way we see the world. And in turn, language shapes what we see. There's a whole philosophy, whole schools of philosophy around this. But, there's an old saying, she who defines the map defines the territory. Literally the way we draw the world, the electoral map, as I'll come to soon, the electoral pendulum. All of these conceptual devices are actually a form of language and communication, and in turn they shape and I'd suggest limit the way we see the world. Now, I'm an economist from the Australia Institute, and I kind of debunk economic language all the time, and I'm always trying to explain to people that in Australia, we think mining's the backbone of the Australian economy, but I hate to break it to everyone, economies don't have a backbone. Like, that happens over in biology, not in economics. And of course, there's 195 countries in the world. Most of them don't even have a backbone, which by our frame of reference makes them spineless. But that's not how they see themselves. So obviously, whose interest is it for Australians to think that we ride on the sheep's back, or the mining industry is the backbone of the economy? Well, it's the people that sell sheep and the people who sell fossil fuels. So language can play a big role in limiting what we see, in defining what we see, and making it harder to talk to other people. So, yeah, I just wanted to talk a bit today about some different kinds of language that we can use.
Yeah, so one of the sort of good words to start with, or good phrases, is hung parliament. And I guess that sort of takes us straight to the core of the issue. Before the 2022 election, the media was very hung up on this idea of a hung parliament, and it was just a constant question that I and the other candidates were being asked. And that's already happening. We don't even have an election called for 2025, assuming it's next year. And already, just about every time I do an interview with a journalist, there's questions around that. But can you speak to that kind of language and how it sort of frames the cultural change that we're going through in this amazing political revolution as negative?
Oh, absolutely. And again, let me start with an economic example. You'll often see the big banks advertising, saying things like, we're the cheapest of the big banks. Now, to be clear, there are 4 big banks in Australia. They dominate the banking market. But there's about 30 licensed banks, and they're all regulated the same. They're all as safe as each other. Deposits in all of them are guaranteed. But when you hear the big banks advertise, they'll compare themselves only to the other big banks. So cheapest of the big banks. It's not really a category. It's like, we're the cheapest of the expensive banks. But they don't want people's heads thinking about all the choices available, so they invent these tiny little categories that help them. Now, that's exactly what the major parties are doing when they use, and I'll come to this a bit later, but, two-party preferred, or the electoral pendulum, which has marginal seats that are all defined in terms of the two-party preferred, we're kind of just pushing all the independents and crossbenchers out. But to be clear, terminology like hung parliament, so nothing will happen, or chaos, lots of things will happen, but not the right things, or even minority government, as if to trivialise it, as if to say, oh, it's not as good as and not as strong. Maybe we need a backbone or something or other. So, yeah, all of this language is very deliberately used to describe structures that the people that like things the way they are would rather you not think about. So they're doing two things at the same time. They're using careful language, but their careful language is designed to kind of blind us to all of the other options that are constitutionally, historically, and internationally, legitimate and on the table.
So I want to go into the media's role in this a bit, but first I want to address this issue of the chaos theory. And I would argue that although there was this sort of doubt seeded before the 2022 election that too many independents in the lower house would create chaos, that myself, I'll kind of leave myself out of it a bit, but the crossbench broadly has actually proved the reverse, that if there is a voice of reason in that chamber, it's from the collective crossbench rather than the two major parties. And also, it does make me hark back to the Gillard years, which in terms of policy achievements and deliverables was a very productive time. So given those two things, why are we constantly reverting to this chaos theory, do you think?
Well, I'll let you stick the boot into the media, but my part of it is that it's easier to cover. Like if you just have to worry about what the Prime Minister thinks and the opposition leader thinks, if you've got good contacts in both their offices, hey, I can get my story filed in no time. So, there's a lot there. I'll let you speculate on some of that. But yeah, look, I mean, there's so much in this sort of idea of, was the Gillard government chaos or what is chaos? But let me just start with, I think, an important bit of political history. If you listen to the Labor Party today, they'll talk about the fact that Kevin Rudd got elected, promised a carbon price, and then the Greens voted it down, and then there was chaos, and then there was Tony Abbott, right? So therefore, no one should ever disagree with Labor ever again, because if you disagree with anything Labor puts up, you'll get chaos and Conservatives winning office. Now, you can see why that's the story they want to tell. It's just unrelated to historical fact. What actually happened was Kevin Rudd was elected in 2007, proposed a carbon price, did a terrible job of selling it, couldn't really get it through the Senate, which I'll come to in a minute. And then he dumped it, and his own party rolled him before the 2010 election. The chaos was from within his own party. His own party elected Julia Gillard. Julia Gillard won the 2010 election. Julia Gillard successfully negotiated a carbon price. The NDIS, Royal Commission into the Catholic Church, passed more legislation than any term of office in modern history. And the whole time Julia Gillard was succeeding, and I'll come to why I think she succeeded in a minute, but that whole 3-year term where she was succeeding in non-chaotically passing legislation, Kevin Rudd was undermining her from within cabinet, got booted out of cabinet, and then finally ran against her into it before the 2013 election. And then Tony Abbott beat Kevin Rudd, and all of that gets left out of Labor's version of why there was chaos. Now, one of the reasons I think Julia Gillard was so successful, I haven't talked about the Senate yet, but it's really important in our Constitution, is that according to our Senate, to make a law, it's got to pass through both houses of Parliament. And while the Prime Minister comes from the party with majority support in the lower house, the Constitution is silent about the Prime Minister and just says if you want to make a law, it's got to pass through both houses. Now, here's what happened with Julia Gillard. She was in a power-sharing parliament, or a minority parliament, if you want to call it that. But she was in a power-sharing parliament where she was a few votes short of the 76 votes required to pass a law through the lower house. So to pass a law through the lower house, she had to talk to the Greens and Rob Oakeshott and Tony Windsor. And she had to negotiate with those three before she introduced a bill to the lower house. Now, here's the fun part. Because she had to negotiate before she tabled the bill in the lower house, and because she needed the support of the Greens in the lower house, every single one, every piece of legislation that the Greens and the minor parties voted for in the lower house, every single one passed through the Senate. Because guess what? The Greens didn't vote against bills in the Senate that they'd already voted for in the lower house. So I would argue that because Julia Gillard had to share power in the lower house, because she had to negotiate with Windsor and Oakeshott and the Greens, that's why she was so good. There's no irony here. It's causal. The fact that she had to negotiate in the lower house meant she was good at negotiating through the Senate, whereas Tony Abbott and Kevin Rudd kind of do I'm the Prime Minister and the Senate should respect my mandate, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a really great sort of picture that you painted there, and it makes me reflect on the experiences that we're having as lower house independents now, because what tends to happen is that the government puts up a bill, we will, in good faith, collaborate, negotiate, stack up evidence for changes, and have those conversations with the various ministers. From time to time, they will accept some of the crossbench amendments in the House. However, they always hold out what are probably the key amendments for the Senate, because they want to have that leverage piece available to them in the Senate. So what's sort of tending to happen is that a lot of that groundwork is laid by the House independents on the really fundamental flaws of the legislation. And it then progresses to the Senate, and a similar conversation takes place, and those amendments will then be accepted in the upper house. And obviously that sort of just it creates some frustration, I think, for the lower house independents, that's not a particularly ideal way of legislating when you're letting stuff go through the lower house that is fundamentally flawed, with a sort of hit it and hope expectation that it'll be fixed in the Senate. And then, as you suggest, sometimes it gets tied up in the Senate because they haven't actually gone even partway to fixing it in the process before.
Oh, absolutely, which is why, personally, I'm not at all concerned if we have a power-sharing parliament after the next election, because if the government of the day has to negotiate with a broad range of voices in the lower house, and then while that negotiation's going on is simultaneously saying to itself and to the public, and we're going to have to negotiate with the Senate as well, this is what our parliament was designed to do. The parliament, as defined by the Constitution, is a power-sharing document. The whole point of our parliament is to not consolidate power in the hands of one person, but to have 150 people in the lower house, 150, 151, half that number in the Senate. The Constitution says that power is shared between the two. Our Constitution doesn't have a president in it because we didn't want to create an individual with veto powers and other powers. So the whole point of our Constitution, which, by the way, didn't mention political parties in its original incarnation. Political parties only get a brief mention in our Constitution after the dismissal. We tidied up some problems with Senate appointments. But political parties aren't even in our Constitution. So the leader of a political party is not supposed to be the one voice of wisdom. Our House of Representatives, there's a hint in the name, is supposed to be representative of broad constituencies. Each member of parliament is supposed to bring a different perspective to it. You're supposed to get a majority there, and then you've got to get a majority in the States House. The whole Constitution's about power sharing, but we've got this culture where that's not the case. So if after the next election, whoever the Prime Minister is knows they have to negotiate with the Senate, knows they have to vote with the lower house, great.
Yeah, there's a lot of entrenched habits. And I do want to go to the media piece before we take some audience questions. I've got a few coming in. But, as you suggest, one argument for why is the media so attached to the two-party system is that it's simply easier. You go to one side, you get their view, you go to the other side, you get their view, and then you write your story and you go home and, have a glass of wine, rather than having to call every single crossbencher to try to figure out what's going to happen. It sort of feels, though, that it runs deeper than that. There was a very dismissive attitude, I think, to the independents before the 2022 election. It was kind of like, oh, this is just a flash in the pan, it's meaningless. You're either not going to get in, or if you do get in, you're not going to have any power. And I kind of likened it a bit to my experience of covering the 2016 US election, where every journalist thought Trump wasn't going to win, except me and a few others. But the same in 2022, a lot of the media had kind of shelved the idea of independents winning key seats, and obviously it went the other way. Well, what do you think underpins that? I mean, I wonder about the sort of history of kind of fringe minority parties and such in the Senate, and whether over time that sort of created that sense among the media that there's a lack of credibility among independents.
Oh, look, it's a great question. I don't have a simple answer. I think that the contempt, let's call it what it is, for many in the media, for anyone who's in Parliament, who isn't kind of a representative of a major party, and indeed a major player in a major party, the kind of contempt for the role of backbenchers, the role of independent or minor party senators. You're right, it's very deep-seated. I'm not quite sure where it comes from, but it has, I guess there's two different spheres in which it's significant. There's the understanding what happens within the Parliament, and the number of times journalists are surprised when I say to them, do you reckon that's going to get through the Senate? They're like, oh, the minister says it will. It's like, okay, well, I can count to 39, and can you count to 39? Because I can't count to 39 votes. And it just often hasn't even occurred to them. So again, that's why I like, terms like power sharing, Parliament, because it forces everyone to remember, oh yeah, just because the minister said it's going to happen, doesn't going to happen. But there's another entirely different domain that we haven't talked about yet that I think it's important to think about, and that's the idea of the marginal seat, or the key seat, or the battleground seat, and the idea that even though there's 150 electorates, that the media can analyse an election through the prism of swinging voters in marginal seats. So we start with 25 million Australians, but we really only, to do our clever political analysis of who's going to win the election, we really only have to say to ourselves, well, there's really only 10 battleground seats, marginal seats. I'll come to how we define them in a sec. And only 20% of voters in that 10 seats are going to change their vote. So we can have a whole national election around how, stressed out, low-income families in outer suburban seats are feeling right now. And the fact that people want something else, in the leafy suburbs, and people want something else in the inner city suburbs, smart political analysts know, you don't have to worry about that. We just have to worry about the marginal seats. But and the Australian Institute will put this paper out next week. Very happy to share it with everyone today. I don't want to go through all the numbers now, but let me just tell you a quick story here. The idea of a safe seat, and in turn a marginal seat, is a construction of the major parties. Indeed, we have terms like the two-party preferred vote. So we take the two-party preferred vote when we do all the polling, and we tell everyone how the major parties are going in the two-party preferred vote. And then we draw them all up on something called the Mackerras pendulum, which puts the safe seats at the top, and they're all the party seats get ranked. And then there's these marginal seats at the bottom of the pendulum. And then we ask how a small national swing will affect which marginal seats will fall. Now, built into this is a whole bunch of unhelpful language, because the two-party preferred vote leaves out the independents and the minor parties. The definition of the marginal seats is literally based purely on there's only two people fighting in the election. There's no such thing as a national swing anymore, because what happened at the last election in Western Australia looked nothing like what happened in Queensland. And by the way, Sophie Scott's won in Mackellar on a 16% margin. The national swing was irrelevant to Sophie beating Jason Falinski.
Yeah.
But let me just end with a couple of quick facts that I think will be really interesting for your audience. So the Australia Institute, in this paper we'll put out next week, we've analysed every seat that changed hands in the last 20 years. 134 seats have changed hands in the last 20 years. And I'm just checking my numbers here. Of the 134 seats that have changed hands, where's my number? 82% of the seats that the major parties swapped were marginal seats. 82%. And 12 were fairly safe. Only 6% of the 134 seats that changed hands between the major parties were safe. But here's the fun part. In the last 20 years, of all the independents elected to Parliament, not one has been in a safe seat. Not one has been in a marginal seat. In the last 20 years, every independent elected to Parliament has won a safe seat or a fairly safe seat. So the whole idea that the press gallery are obsessed with what's happening in the marginals, what are the swinging voters, what's Barry the tradie and Karen the tired mum thinking in the handful of marginal seats, that whole conceptual framework kind of pre-programs them to ignore the fact that independents win safe seats. And yeah, I think that there's a lot of political strategy that flows from that observation, but it's why we have to change the language, because we shouldn't, as a democracy, just be obsessed with what a handful of voters in a handful of seats think.
I love that. That's what people-powered politics can do. You see, we just creep up and no one knows we're coming. And yes, achieving I think we had a 12% swing to win the seat here in Goldstein, and that was a big day. Now, Richard, we have lots of questions coming in from the audience. We better crack through a few. One goes to the exact thing that you were just talking about, which was language. Let's go through some of that word framing. So you talked about minority government, hung parliament, and the two-party preferred, those sorts of labels. What alternative language could we or should we use?
Oh, look, I guess that's up to everyone, but let's admit we need it. As I said, I talk about power-sharing parliaments a lot. Unless I'm talking amongst close friends, I'd never talk about hung parliaments. I don't use any of that shorthand. I never talk about chaos. By the way, in this paper I was talking about, pretty much every state and territory is used to this at the moment. New South Wales is in a power-sharing parliament right now. No one cares. It's not the end of the world. Biggest state in Australia, no big deal. People have to talk to each other. So whether we talk about the power of balance, whether we talk about power-sharing parliaments, whether we talk about people-powered parliaments, I don't have a strong view. I'm just an economist and a strategist. I'll leave the linguistics to others. But what we shouldn't do is use language that reinforces things that we're trying to change. And then that's hard because the media will keep using that language. I promise you that. So we just over time have to patiently chip away at that and find ways to mock it. Does anyone think that Scott Morrison's government wasn't chaos? Does anyone think, watching Scott Morrison bribe the National Party with $20 billion in dams that we didn't need so that we could say commit to net zero, was that good government? So I think we need to mock their language and never reinforce it.
Another question that's come in is around the likelihood or possibility of the existing federal duopoly joining forces against an ever-expanding crossbench. It seems to me that they are so polarised that I can barely imagine that happening. But can you speak to that, Richard? Can you see that in your crystal ball at any point?
Oh, absolutely. Once upon a time, I was Natasha Stott-Despoja's chief of staff, and John Howard was prime minister at the time. The Democrats were in balance of power. There's a lot of times where I was in conversations that the Labor Party, the coalition, and the Democrats worked together to, keep the Greens and other independents out. So this is not hypothetical. The question is, in the heat of the battle, are they going to compete or cooperate? To be clear, the major parties agree on fossil fuel subsidies, they agree on AUKUS, they agree on all sorts of things. But what I think is more likely than the cooperation implied in the question is cooperation, which I think we might even see next week, where the major parties try and change the way that we run our elections in ways that will help both the major parties. So I think we'll see them get enthusiastic about public funding for incumbents, designed to make it harder for independents and minor parties to raise money for a donation. So there's a lot of cooperating always happens in Parliament. You've seen that. Everyone's if you look closely, you see it all the time. But I don't think they'll merge parties in the foreseeable future, but they may well agree increasingly on electoral law reform that's good for them, good for incumbents, and bad for new entrants. Imagine if we let Coles and Woolworths decide where Aldi could set up.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great analogy. There's another question that says each sitting day of Parliament starts with a prayer for guidance to do the best for all Australians. When did they all lose sight of that commitment? And I guess I would extend that question to say that if in desperation for self-protection, they did go down a pathway of forming some sort of bizarre coalition in the future, or even as they do the kinds of things that you're talking about with so-called election reform in order to protect themselves, doesn't that inexorably continue to undermine the trust of the electorate in them, which is the very reason that they would be forced into joining forces in the first place? So is it sort of an endless downward spiral if you start doing that?
It's an endless arm wrestle. Whether it spirals downward or whether it corrects itself, I think time will tell. Again, let's think about language here. In Australia, the Australian parliamentary culture, not our constitution, our culture is quite unique in that we have the tightest block voting, the sort of party block voting of really any Western democracy. I have a joke about this. Like, we call it crossing the floor, when in very rare circumstances, a member of one party will vote with the other. And my joke is, what do they call crossing the floor in America? Voting. Right? They don't have a term for it. It just happens all the time. So, I think that we need to understand that in Australia, the political culture of our parties, not the constitution, the culture is that if you're a member of a party and you're elected under a party logo, you will vote the way your party tells you to. You'll have a voice in that, but if you don't get your way, you will vote that way. Now, the problem there is, of course, when you've got big parties that have got lots of interests, you've got donor interests, you've got party interests, you've got MPs' interests, it's very hard to find a position that reflects what people in all the different electorates think. So, I mean, a question that I always put back to people is, if you don't like independents in Parliament, why do you like dependents in Parliament? Who do you want your member? Who do you want your local member of Parliament to be dependent on? Because the Constitution imagined they'd be dependent on you, the local voter, but we've created this very polite bureaucratic compromise where well-meaning, these are some of my friends, well-meaning elected members of Parliament can't vote their conscience and can't vote what their community wants they have to vote the way the party wants them to. Now, they don't do that out of, evil intent, but the consequence is they're separated from their community.
Well, and I think another manifestation of that too is if you're a member of one of the major parties and you're not a minister who is in the weeds of that particular policy, you don't get into the weeds of it. So as independents, we look in detail at all of the legislation, and, some of the flagship or more critical legislation, it involves weeks of analysis by us and our teams as we decide whether to vote for or against it, what needs to be fixed in it, all those sorts of things. Whereas I think being a major party backbencher is a very different job. Obviously, some of them take interest in some pieces of legislation, but they kind of don't need to in many ways because they have to vote a particular way. I guess, because I'm not in their party rooms or caucus, I don't know how it works, but I guess in the background they do their advocacy within the party machine, right, as that policy is being developed. Once the legislation lands, it's done.
Exactly. And, I often get questions like, oh, Richard, how are you getting on with the government? And I understand what people mean by the question. It sounds sincere, but my answer is always, well, what do you mean there? The Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's office, the front bench, the party room, the party, the state parties. This is just a mass of humans who privately disagree with each other all the time with, hopefully with good intentions. What's hard for people to understand, and I respect it, I just think it's a tough job and not one I'd want to do. But after all of that massive disagreement, then once the party's adopted a position, then that's it. That's what we're all at. So, for 2 years, the Australia Institute, under this government, was saying, this stage 3 tax cut's a joke. You've got to change it. You've got to change it. You've got to change it. And for 2 years, there was not a glint. There was not a crack a millimetre wide in any public positioning from any member of the government, front bench or back bench. But of course, I'm on the phone to people all the time who are saying, keep going, keep going. Half of us hate it, keep going. Now, I respect their confidences, but my point is this thing that the major parties present to us is a big kind of unified whole. And unfortunately, I think that does our democracy a bit of a disservice because it trains voters to think that no other possibilities even exist, when of course they exist, and they're often fiercely advocated for by individual members of parliament. But once they've made that decision, then everyone's locked in, and then we see bipartisan support at the moment between the government and the opposition for the AUKUS submarines. Now, personally, I don't know a Labor member of Parliament that privately supports them, but you won't get one of them to say a word publicly. They're not allowed to.
No, we really should be having a national debate about that. So, Richard, we've got like a minute or so left. I just want to close by saying that I would argue that the 2022 election was a disruption moment. The next election, in my view, is a consolidation moment in order to really cement what we've been able to achieve and build that in order to create this more collaborative environment where we actually are able to lead genuinely, authentically on behalf of our communities to achieve beneficial policy change rather than the combative relationships that have characterised Australian politics for many years, largely underpinned by fear and loathing, and what's happened in the last couple of weeks around net zero targets, for example, is just a return to the bad old days, in my view. So for everyone who's watching, I think what I would say is I think we're on the cusp of great cultural change, and what we need to do now is really just embed that, and that's incredibly exciting. What last word would you offer to our audience?
Look, I share that sentiment. I think democracy thrives on high expectations. People who love things the way they are like to try and convince everyone it's impossible to change things. And if nothing else, what yourself and other independent candidates did at the last election was to show people that we really can change things, and that voices that we were told were irrelevant because they were in safe seats, those voices are now much louder than they used to be. And I think minority government, power sharing parliament, is the most likely scenario in the lower house after the next election. It's inevitable in the Senate. So I think we just need to get better at making people feel confident about that by kind of mocking the idea that Scott Morrison was stable and reminding people of how productive both this term of government and how much better it's been with you guys in there, and even how much better it would be if we look down the track and have more voices, not just being heard, but having a say, having a vote that counts because of a power sharing parliament.
Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute, thank you so much for taking the time for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.